DM doesn't understand the history skill. Short Minor 1 has a palate cleanser from the real bad horror stories. My DM makes us roll history checks for any of our characters' memories. Me. Hey, DM! It's been a few sessions and I can't recall. What was the name of the NPC's daughter again? DM.
Roll a history check.
Me. While it's been 3 weeks for us, it's only been half an hour for my character. He would know this easily. DM.
Well, let's see. Roll a history check.
For added context, I was an avid note-taker even before this. But now, I'm basically having to write everything he says, because I'll never know when my character will potentially forget how to breathe due to a bad roll. The extra shifty thing about that being his stenographer is taking me out of the game while I scramble to make sure I have everything down. In case you're a DM like this. Per the player's handbook, your intelligence history check measures your ability to recall lore about historical events, legendary people, ancient kingdoms, past disputes, recent wars, and lost civilizations. Not, does your character remember how to tie their shoes or who their father was? Yeah, I think this DM just turned his story into the plot of Memento. My name is Jacob Crow, and welcome to the Crow's Perch, where we go through the latest and greatest RPG horror stories because we're masochists or something. Why spread joy and cheers in the RPG community when you could post cringe? So today, we have 2 very long stories, so let's just jump into the first one. What happens when a cleric chooses the Simp domain and decides it's his oath-bound duty to prevent your wife from having sex with you? Well, we're gonna find out. So, without further ado, let's talk about how we're never recognized for holding the door open because no one understands and chivalry's dying and I just want the kids back, Stacy, please. Anyway, gather up a murder or something, I don't care. Old story, but one I've been thinking about a lot recently. Okay, so this was a one-shot at a convention a friend of mine was running as his first foray into DMing. It looked like a module, but I don't know the name. Basically, a load of goblins had been stealing from travelers, and were taking it back to a cave network, where it turned out they were giving it to a dragon for its hoard. The players in this drama are me, male human fighter, my wife, male dwarf barbarian, the DM, my sister-in-law, female half-elf rogue, a random girl that wanted to go, the same female half-elf rogue, and problem, male elf cleric. The game has 4 set characters. Normally I would play the cleric or the barbarian, but as I was the most experienced and had been GMing for a long time, I said I would just take what was left to fill out the party and help the new GM or new players if there were any problems or they needed advice. By rule of ladies first, and my sister-in-law and the other girl, whose name I don't remember, not knowing what to do, meant my wife picks first, and she decided to play the dwarf barbarian to try something different to a rogue or bard. My sister-in-law and the girl had been talking, and asked if they could both play the half-elf rogue so that they could confirm what to do as they hadn't played before. DM says that's okay, and my wife offers to help them, as rogue was her main class. Then Nice Guy goes next, as I'd been okay with, and I had been telling him earlier that I main cleric, and it's a fairly back-of-party role and responsible role. He picks elf cleric. Fair enough. That leaves me with the human fighter. Now before I get into the session, I should mention that there have been other red flags with Nice Guy, so I will list a few of the big ones. Number 1. Repeatedly talked over any women he was nearby while proclaiming how much of a feminist he was. Number 2. Telling us that marriage and monogamy is an outdated and sexist concept of the monogamous patriarchy. My wife was my fiancée at the time. Number 3. Spent almost 10 minutes arguing why he should have won a round of Cards Against Humanity because his was smarter and wouldn't accept that my sister-in-law's was funnier as a reason. Number 4. Rejected alcoholic drinks that were bought for the table we were at as I was a guest at the event because alcohol weakens the mind. Number 5. Explaining to my Irish friend how stupid the troubles in Ireland were when my friend's family were on both sides and lost family during the troubles. Number 6. Telling my wife how much she reminds him of a character from My Little Pony who appears to have severe social anxiety. My wife has severe clinical anxiety and has been in therapy for years to get better, So being compared to this character did not help. And we had found out he has a huge crush on that character, and even has prawn of that character on his phone. Oh no. Number 7. He told me that my wife was good how she was, and that I should stop trying to turn her into something she isn't. Note that something she isn't is confident, likes being around people, and handles her anxiety. The how she was quiet, scared, meek, and had panic attacks round the clock just from being near her friends and family, never mind a convention of almost 3,000 people. There are a lot more, and this guy had been in our group for years, and we just couldn't get rid of him, partly because most of us wouldn't tell him to sod off because they were shy, and the 3 of us that would have didn't want to, because he had a ton of issues, and we just felt sorry for the guy. And other members, including my wife, the GM of this game, and many others would always make excuses that he didn't understand, or he's just a little awkward, or he's harmless. Looking back, I now realize that's how so many people like him get away with some really toxic behavior, and I don't put up with this kind of behavior anymore, even if I wind up looking like the bad guy. Back to campaign. As soon as the game starts, Nice Guy, who is playing the cleric, decides to take every opportunity to get in the way of my wife, who is playing a dwarf barbarian wielding a +1 great axe, +3 against goblins. He has a sling and a scimitar, and decides that as a man of God, he must be on the front line protecting m'lady. Note that the dwarf barbarian my wife is playing is male. I tried to gently explain to him that that was a bad idea. He was a purely healing and buffing cleric, no damaging spells, studded leather armor, that he wasn't working with the party. He continually dragged out every fight longer than it should have by getting in the way, trying to take hits for my wife's character, and occasionally the 2 girls' rogue, though not as often. He ignored everything, even when I suggested fighting from the back line with the rogue, who by the way, were playing amazingly. Between the 2 of them, they came up with really creative solutions, pinged enemies from the back line, and got the hang of backstabbing really quickly, as me and my wife were the front line, and we needed ranged support. He continued to physically get in the way, to defend the barbarian dwarf, and try to attack high-level enemies. The table is getting angrier. The DM is losing control, and getting disheartened, and my wife is furious at him to the point where this normally very shy and quiet woman starts almost screaming at him to get to the back, or she'll chop off his head and we'll go on without him. No one but him and me argued with that idea. But it continued until he became so much of a problem, and we only had the table for about 30 minutes more, and we weren't even halfway through to the dungeon. Finally, I passed a note to the DM. I tie the cleric up and carry him. He made me make a roll for both, and there it was. I had to abandon my bow and hand out some of my potions, but that was fine. The rogue girls were ecstatic to get a bow rather than throwing knives. We carry on, occasionally swapping between my fighter and my wife's barbarian. Looking back, he tried to make escape checks a lot less often when my wife's character was carrying him, which has just skeeved us both out at the thought. We meet the boss of the dungeon, a goblin chief riding a spider. Perfect. I dump the cleric and tell him to stay there, out of trouble. The fight begins, and that guy is constantly trying to escape, until he does. He charges past the rogue on 2 hit points, runs past me dealing with 3 goblins and on half hit points, and puts himself directly between my wife's barbarian, who is at full hit points, and the goblin chief she had been preparing a big attack for. An attack that would deal 3d8 plus 10 damage to this goblin chief. He took the damage from the goblin chief, 1d6 with d6 poison damage, and it nearly floored him. This attack would have barely scratched my wife's barbarian, because of course it wouldn't. She was a barbarian, and a dwarf, and had advantage against goblins and poison. After I finally lose my temper with him, and my wife having to move her character model and charge the attack a further 2 rounds, the fight was done, and we won, and I ordered him to heal the rogue while my wife and I take health potions. He still tries to heal my wife's barbarian, who had taken a total of 2 points of damage, which was completely his fault for getting in the way and dragging out the fight and forcing her to suffer an attack of opportunity. But she has her dwarf physically slap him, and in character scream at him, and he does as she says. Even me and the DM were done with this guy's shit at this point, and we had 10 minutes left. We cleared over half the dungeon in 20 minutes when he was tied up, when before that, it had taken us almost an hour and a half to get to the halfway point because of him slowing us down. This is when the DM shows us what was meant to be the epic dragon fight at the end of the dungeon. The dragon flies away to speed things up, which pisses us all off. This results in one of my first time in character PvP moments, and the rogue, using a bag of goblin heads they had gotten off my wife during one of the trades of carrying the cleric. She had been collecting the heads in a burlap sack for, in my wife's words, serial killer reasons. They join in as we lay into the cleric until he is dead and bleeding. While the barbarian stole all the loot, we would take his money and then claim that the goblins killed the cleric while we curse his name into oblivion. He complained to anyone that would listen. But by that point, I took everyone away and ran a game of MAIDENLESS to calm down and refused to let him join. I felt bad later and would later apologize to DM for how things went down, but he told me he was happy because that guy apparently had done the same thing the day before and learned nothing, and would proceed to get in the way of combat to save the lovely lady he was crushing on, even if she was playing a dwarf barbarian or dragonborn paladin, until he was finally told he was banned from joining in any of the one-shots being run at the convention due to dragging the games out and making sessions late and not finish due to time constraints. I would later lose contact with Nice Guy, and I don't regret it one bit. After he sent a plush of that same My Little Pony character he fetishized and told my wife that she was like, under the guise of a birthday present. Her birthday is in August, and he sent it in June. TLDR, Nice Guy Simp plays cleric and tries to protect my wife, ruining the campaign, and then gets butthurt after we kill him in-game and refuse to let him simp all over a game of Maids RPG. Look, I know this is probably going to upset people on the internet, but I will never fucking understand why people want to flock My Little Pony characters. As for the simp himself, I understand social awkwardness rather intimately, as I've been with partners and have friends and family that can find it incredibly difficult to socialize. But then there's people like Simp that use this as some kind of favor or excuse to be a creep. And when someone like Simp uses this against a group of socially awkward friends, it turns into an ironclad defense, usually leading to the whole group just dropping the whole thing and thinking that they're the ones who are overreacting. If you can, call out bad behavior like this at the table. And if you can't, then tell it to someone who can, or the whole group if possible. Don't let it fester, or people like Simp will just keep escalating until they send your wife a picture of their host in this next story about a TTRPG relationship that goes too far. Breakups suck, and they're even worse when they happen between party members in your D&D table. Breakups are even worse when that drama begins to seep into both the game and real life. So, without further ado, let's finish filing a restraining order as we continue the murder and dive right into this story. People can get weirdly attached to their characters, but it takes a special kind of person to take it to the point of threats and verbal assault, stalking, and sabotage. I had been DMing a game for some work friends as a way to introduce some of them to the game, alongside some long-term players, so that the game would not only flow a little easier, but the requirement for me as DM to teach the game at a base level would be alleviated somewhat, so I could concentrate on actually DMing. Now, some will say that DMing for workmates is not always a good idea, as it can lead to some in-real-life issues if things don't go so well. In 20 plus years of TTRPGs, as both a DM and as a player, I never really had this issue, beyond some newfound and failed personal romantic relationships that led to some minor issues, and some weirdness when in-character romance led to confusion off the table. This was one of those times. The game in and of itself was nothing to really write home about. A basic homebrew setup, set on the Sword Coast with some basic plagiarism from Neverwinter, with a little Assassin's Creed and Legacy of Kain for flavor. Nothing too spicy, but with enough flavor to keep the veterans interested, while being flexible enough for me as a DM to make it easily digestible for the fresh players. It all came to a head a little after one of our new players, a pretty generic tiefling warlock, Becca, with a weird flair for the dramatic that I wanted to encourage, got involved in a romantic tryst with one of my established players, a vengeance paladin, George, who was just on the verge of becoming an oathbreaker after finding out that the object of his vengeance crusade had been a fabrication of his own damaged mind, and that he had been the one to do the rather dastardly deed that put him on the path during an extended weekend of drunken debauchery, brought about from some spiked ale and a run-in with his emotionally abusive father. It was a weird backstory, a tad grimdark and edgy, but it seemed interesting at the time, so I went with it. This tied in quite well with our little warlock, who had a habit of mixing any and all wild and unusual herbs and random monster bits into concoctions that she would sell in town. For fun, we rolled on a random effects list, all non-lethal, with a D100 to see what the potions did. And it turned out that this leaned pretty well with her backstory and patronage to a fey trickster's spirit. At this time, the story was focused on the paladin and his present ongoing self-loathing, and the party was debating if George was going to break his oath or seek out those who had spiked his drink back in his hometown. Now, I know that the party were pretty much expecting me to trope this hell and have the warlock be the one that spiked the drink, etc., but I'm not that kind of DM, and I enjoy taking expectations like this and tossing them to the wind. But this one had legs, and I kinda wanted it to be more linked to the warlock's patron rather than her as an individual. Sessions passed, and we ended up venturing into the Fey realm to confront the definitely not Summer Lady and her people, which led to the paladin taking a level in warlock himself and focusing his vengeance on those that had actually spiked him rather than the lady herself, and form a much closer bond with the warlock, who in turn started to focus more toward a hexblade build, while the party druid and cleric respectively took bets on when the pair would hook up, and the other new player, a fighter obsessed with rats, as rodents of unusual size and the disposal of them via incredible feats of violence were pretty much the cornerstone of his own backstory, sought out new and unusual weapons of rodent destruction. Becca and George bonded quite a bit, so much so that it started to spill over in real life, and the pair kinda started dating. I noted with both of them that although I had no issue with this both in and out of character, if it caused issues at the table for whatever reason, I would put my foot down as DM, and either remove one or both of them from the game. For a while, all was well. There were no real issues until the Warlock's player got promoted in work. As our new team leader in real life, things started out brilliantly, with her able to set timetables so that we, her the fighter and myself, would have time off on a Saturday to play, and could work Sundays, and discuss the previous night's game in our downtime. It was really a dream come true in many respects, at least until the fighter, Sebastian, caused a bit of a ruckus during Becca and George's RP when he headed downstairs after a Fade to Black moment, and I had turned my attention to the rest of the table while they roleplayed Snuggles. Sebastian, as I pointed out, had a bit of an obsession with rodents, so much so that he had developed an uncanny ability to always know when a building was infested, and took it upon himself to deal with any scurrying pests for a nominal fee. This had been a fun way to earn some small coin, and the player had really taken to it, even considering ranger levels so he could lean into it harder. As he was a new player, this enthusiasm had to be encouraged, and thus with snuggle time ongoing, he and the other players opted to head to the basement and play whack-a-mole with the local rodent population for fun and profit. This led to them finding out that the former owner of the inn had at one stage been an adventurer himself, and some low-level magic items had been stashed, one of which was a pretty nifty +1 rapier and +1 buckler, which, after some small debate, it was agreed the fighter should definitely keep. The next day, in real life, was a little odd, as the warlock player seemed a lot sharper than normal and pretty much kept to herself. Nonetheless, The week passed and everything seemed normal until the fighter player found himself scheduled to work on game night. The warlock player offered her apology and made it seem like this was an oversight and said that she would go out of her way to make sure this wouldn't happen again. Game night came around, and with no fighter player to take part, he had agreed, at work, to simply have his character so exhausted by the prior night's mini-adventure that he would simply pay for another night at the inn and stay in bed while we hunted the town for our paladin's antagonists, or some form of information related to similar incidents. It was at this time that Becca piped up and noted that it would be a shame to leave the sleeping fighter's new shiny toys behind when George could use them just as well, or better, if we ran into trouble. I nixed this idea pretty hard and advised that he was attuning to them, and that was clearly why he was so tired. And even if they could take them from the sleeping fighter, I would have to ask the player if this was okay, as it had been agreed by those that found them that the fighter should have them. She seemed okay with this at the time, so I let it pass, in spite of the blatant red flag. Things went fairly smoothly once again, and the party, after a quick chat with the local guard and some sleuthing, I dropped a plot hook that would lead them out of town to a local distillery. Again, the following day, the warlock player seemed oddly distracted and didn't want to discuss the prior night's game. So I filled in the fighter on what happened, and he seemed hyped to test his new toys on the distillery, as it was bound to have rats, lol. The week passes, and once again the fighter found himself scheduled to work on game night. As I didn't want to move the game on without him, I cancelled the session and opted to simply have the lads over for a drink and some pizza, with a declined offer for a one-shot as they wanted to stay focused on the game in hand. The warlock player opted to not come, so we had a fairly silly night of Mario Kart and beer. It got to about 11 or 12, and I got chatting properly with my longtime table buddy and present paladin player about the game. He confessed that he had mentioned being a bit miffed on missing out on the rat catching and a chance of a magical weapon, and had talked to the warlock player about it during their date night. She had seemed upset that he had missed out because of snuggle time, and had blamed herself for the roleplay bed-based distraction. He had shrugged it off as, "That's just D&D," and told her that more toys were bound to turn up. It wasn't until an hour or so later that we put two and two together. This led to a bit of a drunk dial and a bit of a blowout between them, when she confessed to intentionally scheduling the fighter away from the table so that the paladin could get the magical weapons, and that she was going to bring him back when I was more fair. The following day in work was less than fun, with the warlock player having a go at me for ruining her relationship, and warning me that if I talked about her behind her back, that I would find myself scheduled on every Saturday from this point on. I countered with, "Well, you will have a hard time playing the game without a DM," which seemed to shut down the threat pretty damn quickly. Saturday came, and lo and behold, everyone was free to play. The scheduling issue seemingly resolved, and we got to rolling dice. Again, for a few weeks, things went well. Magic items did in fact turn up, and a story was in fact forthcoming. What also happened is that in-game, snuggle time was pretty much off the table, as the paladin, now significantly more wary of the in-real-life power games that his new bow was capable of, opted to keep the party together rather than engage in tabletop randiness. The warlock was less than happy, and took to sulking in real life and only paying lip service to the game, before eventually opting to retire her character fully and leave the table. One would think this is where this story ends. Sadly, not. With no risk of tabletop overspill, the paladin player and former warlock continued to date, and work-based D&D chats continued without the potential fallout, and with a keen interest regarding the retired Becca and George's in-character long-distance love life, which was still more or less now an established character point due to the now combined backstory elements. This was fine, until mention of any form of paladin-based flirting or charisma-based interactions were mentioned. He flirted with a barmaid for information in character, nothing more, and I once again found myself working a Saturday and a game night being postponed. When that failed to deter the paladin from having an in-character life once again, the fighter found himself on an odd schedule and unable to play. It was especially odd because after the first incident, we opted to keep any events regarding the game, and more specifically the paladin, well out of earshot. Through luck or coincidence, we were able to get around the table together and get a game in with some low-key story events that there was no way that our former warlock could possibly know about, that involved the forced swearing of the paladin's firstborn to his fey patron, and a passing off-the-cuff comment regarding when they were gonna do it, as he would have to ask the missus, implying that he was going to procreate with the patron herself to fulfill the bargain. Sunday was hell. Our former warlock being furious that I would allow such a thing to happen, when I knew the paladin and her were still in a relationship in-game, and that I had to change it immediately, or she would again make sure that I was working every Saturday, as it no longer mattered to her, as she was no longer playing. I simply said I would move to another day, and that she had no say in what happened at my table. She was less than pleased. I worked the next 3 Saturdays and moved the game to a Sunday or Friday respectively, DMPCing the fighter under his request, when he couldn't make the game night. Again, key events that there is no possible way she could know about kept cropping up in the form of snide remarks and curt comments. I presumed that the paladin had been letting slip, or that somebody had said something, but all the players at the table swore that they had said nothing. It took almost 2 months to find out she was accessing the paladin's Google Drive and reading his notes. We only found out when he changed his phone and had to reset his Google password, a password, I should point out, that he had never shared with our former warlock. This led to a full-on fit in work, when she demanded to know what happened in-game. When I refused to answer, she called our paladin and demanded he tell her. He refused, pulled her on accessing his Google Drive, and after a bit of a screaming match in her office, apparently dumped her there and then, as he couldn't trust her. This doubled down when both the fighter and I requested a team transfer, due to internal differences and toxic work environment, which thanks to her little fit, was now office public knowledge. The game suspended for a week or two while the fighter and myself moved to another team, and got our schedules aligned, and the game carried on from that point as normal. Work did get a little rough as I was being badmouthed quite aggressively, but that ended when the fighter and I started working from home, thanks to the plague times, and the game moved to Discord. Suffice to say, Snuggle Time is now off my table between players. As for the former Warlock player, boyfriend, lost. D&D, lost. Respect at work, lost. Friends and colleagues, lost. Due to her blow-up at work, she also lost respect and chances of leading additional teams as she blew up in the office. She has 2 strikes now against her, from our reports of toxic workplace-based behavior and verbal assault to employees, which has seen her lose her position as team lead when lockdown happened, and is unlikely to get it back due to those reports. Okay, first off, obvious point. Don't date your boss. I know, they were dating before she got promoted, but power dynamics are a bitch, and regardless of how chill that person is, that dynamic is still there. I'm not your HR, but just keep that in mind at the bare minimum. I think romance in D&D is fine. I understand why someone in this game would choose not to have any relationships between characters in their games, considering how this story went. But that is also because Becca was clearly too immature to handle her real-life relationship with George, let alone reconcile her make-believe relationship between her character and his paladin. Considering Becca's actions, I think it's safe to assume D&D isn't the only thing she painstakingly stalked George over. Becca was abusive, manipulative, and incredibly insecure, and I hope the OP of this story and the rest of their party never has to deal with any of her BS ever again. Thank you for tuning in to today's stories, and I'm sorry for the long video. I missed last week's upload, so I figured I'd just combine 2 big stories to give you about the same amount of time. And if you like this story and would like to see more of them, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. And if you can't think of anything to comment, maybe comment something about your own workplace experiences with D&D. Were your work friends your best players or your worst players? Let the rest of us know. As we transition into Art of the Week.
Art of the Week! This week's Art of the Week is by user and patron McYeetly, who depicts the crow on his day off. I love how the rest of the outfit is just something he can slip off, but the bird head is not. This is like some man race shit, I love it. Tell you how you doing, it's the crow's perch. I'm walking here. Incredible stuff. I lost the accent at this point. This is great. You too can submit your own art by submitting it to the art channel on the Crow's Perch Discord, or by sending it to my business email in my channel's About section, or just DM me on Twitter. Once again, a special thank you to my patrons, like Novatonix, Shepdog, and Reuven Gritters. The reason why the Crow's able to take a day off is because of you, the Counts of Quills, like Critical Kunic, Evix, King Drazil, Christian Pipp, Cosmosis, Cookie Spokes, Rikus, Vincent, Ailey Thompson, Zero Fang, and Netscape Navigator. Pay $5, yes? And become a Baron of Beaks, like Chunky Salsa, Tech Blog, Kurestor, Jake Sine, AModestPastry, Jester King, Gintahl, Misfit, Gibber-Woods, Wormy, Matthew MulQueeny, Dan of the Drake, McYeetly, and Anja. And above all else are the Dukes of Feathers, like Jared Zemlin, Staniel Das Boot, Henna, General Constantine Chase, HappyRex, Dork Salty 96, and of course, Acroth. You too can support the channel for as little as $1 a month by going on the Crow's Perch Patreon, link in the description down below. And with all of that out of the way, I will see you next time as the crow flies.